Man, Square really was firing on all cylinders throughout the 90s. From around 1993 to 1998, the company was rapidly expanding beyond just being the Final Fantasy studio, branching into new projects and IPs. Most were still RPGs at heart, but Square managed to explore a surprising range of ideas, tones, and gameplay styles within the genre. In 1993, they released Secret of Mana, originally meant for the cancelled Nintendo Sony console before being retooled for the SNES. During development, part of the Mana team splintered off to create Chrono Trigger in 1995, with help from the Final Fantasy VI crew once that game wrapped. From there came Final Fantasy VII, the blockbuster that finally cemented Square's presence in Western markets. The following year, Square released Parasite Eve, at the time arguably their most unexpected project in years. It pushed them away from fantasy and into horror, a genre that felt almost alien for the studio. Allegedly, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, Parasite Eve, and even Xenogears all originated from the same internal brainstorming session, which, if true, shows just how overflowing with ideas Square's staff were in the mid-90s. That's not even counting side projects like Super Mario RPG and Final Fantasy Tactics, both hits in their own right. Just like Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger supposedly began as the same project, the same can be said for Final Fantasy VII and Parasite Eve. Early drafts of FF7's story revolved around a New York detective before morphing into the steampunk city of Midgar, and that detective concept eventually carried over into Parasite Eve. The game itself was based on a 1995 Japanese sci-fi horror novel of the same name, which also got a 1997 film adaptation. Developed in California by a hybrid team of Japanese and American staff, Parasite Eve tackled darker subject matter than any Square game before it, and became their first title ever rated M by the ESRB. Despite sharing a name with the book, the game isn't an adaptation, but rather a sequel. It features original characters and shifts the setting from Tokyo to New York, but continues the novel's premise, built around the idea of the endosymbiotic theory. The idea that mitochondria were once independent organisms that evolved to live symbiotically within our cells. If that's true, then theoretically, mitochondria could evolve again to act independently of the body, and the novel explored that concept's horrifying implications. What if our mitochondria decided to take back control? I mean, they are the powerhouse of the cell, after all. The villain of both the book and the game, the titular Eve, claims to be the origin of all human mitochondria, and seeks to free them from their human hosts. Her power lets her manipulate biological energy with nightmarish results. Spontaneous combustion, grotesque mutations, and the fusion of living beings into writhing, mind-linked masses. As in the novel, Eve plans to use a chosen human host to birth the ultimate life form, an unstoppable, rapidly evolving creature. The game's story unfolds across 6 days, beginning on Christmas Eve of 1997. So yes, Parasite Eve is technically a Christmas game. When Mitochondria Eve reveals herself during an opera performance at Carnegie Hall, disaster erupts. NYPD officer Aya Brea emerges as the sole survivor, mysteriously immune to Eve's influence, and as such soon finds herself the only one capable of stopping her, uncovering secrets about her own past and why she alone resists Eve's control. Parasite Eve was built on the Final Fantasy VII engine, so the presentation is familiar. Pre-rendered backgrounds, fixed camera angles, and an ATB-style battle system. But that's where the similarities end. If anything, the game feels more like an evolution of Chrono Trigger, just centered around a single character instead of a party. When enemies appear, battles take place right on the field instead of transitioning to a separate screen. Like in Chrono Trigger, Aya's position determines her attack range, but this time you can actually move freely, dodging attacks or closing in for better aim. As she gains experience, her stats improve: HP, ATB speed, and inventory space, while battle performance earns bonus points, or BP, that can be spent to boost those stats further, or to enhance weapons and armor. The better you fight, the more BP you earn, rewarding skillful, efficient play. Aya's arsenal reflects her police background: handguns, shotguns, rifles, machine guns, even grenade launchers. In addition to each weapon type offering unique pros and cons, rifles having amazing range, machine guns having exceptional firing speed, so on and so forth, each specific model of gun offers distinct traits, such as burst shots, firing multiple shots per turn, and even stealing items. Meanwhile, armor provides the expected buffs and resistances. By presenting the right permits to the NYPD's weapons department, you can add extra ability slots, and by using special tools, you can transfer stats or abilities between equipment. For instance, you can carry over all your stat upgrades from an old handgun to a new one that has higher base stats. Normally, transferring stats or traits destroys the donor weapon or armor, but rare super tools let you do it without losing anything, allowing determined players to build one ultimate set of gear by the end. Even the useless junk item dropped by enemies has purpose. Collect 200 pieces, and the NYPD's gunsmith will forge a new weapon from the scrap. Whether that turns out to be a powerhouse or a total dud, though, depends entirely on luck. Beyond weapons and armor, Aya also learns Parasite energy abilities, effectively magic spells, as she levels up. These range from healing and buffs to devastating attacks, culminating in a flashy transformation move. There are no items to restore Parasite energy, but it refills gradually during battle. However, repeated use within a single battle slows regeneration each time, discouraging players from spamming these abilities. Combined, these systems create an RPG framework full of moving parts, encouraging players to experiment and customize how they approach combat. Like many RPGs of the time, Parasite Eve uses fixed save points, which in this case are represented diegetically as telephones where Aya reports in. And like many horror games of the time, Aya has limited inventory space, starting with around a dozen or so slots and expanding by one slot per level. When space runs out, items can be discarded, stored at the police station, or even left in open chests for later retrieval. Chest contents are also semi-randomized, not in their placement but in their rewards, giving each playthrough small variations. That tiny bit of randomness helps, because Parasite Eve is both short and linear. Written and directed by Chrono Trigger's Takashi Tokida, the game manages to carry over Trigger's trademark brisk pacing, but not its variety. Chrono Trigger lasted a good 20 to 30 hours and featured several alternate endings via New Game Plus. Parasite Eve, meanwhile, is unlikely to last longer than 10 to 12 hours. Even by 1998 standards, this was short for an RPG, and despite spanning 2 discs, much of that storage went to FMVs rather than gameplay content. Now, I actually don't mind shorter games a lot of the time, and Parasite Eve is a fast-paced experience that's well-structured, but it's also limited in scope, offering little incentive to replay once the credits roll. And that's where the game's biggest issue lies. Parasite Eve feels less interested in being a great video game than it does with being a great story. Square even marketed it as the world's first cinematic RPG, a novel and extravagant idea in 1998, though quaint by today's standards. Modern games routinely combine grandiose storytelling with interactive depth, offering branching outcomes or meaningful player choice. Parasite Eve, meanwhile, remains locked to a single linear narrative path, despite branching outcomes and meaningful player choice generally being big selling points of both genres the game is attempting to meld. The 6 in-game days correspond to the game's 6 chapters, each with fixed locations and scripted events. Players can revisit old areas to grind or gather items, but despite featuring an impressive interactive 3D model of Manhattan, the city essentially functions as a fancy level select menu. The second-to-last chapter offers a bonus dungeon and optional super boss for a rocket launcher, but otherwise you're funneled straight through the main story from start to finish. Square's priorities were clear: narrative first, interactivity second. While the story is engaging and the pacing tight, the gameplay simply doesn't have enough depth to sustain multiple runs. Once you've experienced the story, there's little reason to return beyond curiosity or nostalgia. Once those credits roll, you've pretty much seen everything the game has to offer. Again, following in the footsteps of Chrono Trigger, Parasite Eve includes a New Game Plus mode, or as it's called here, EX game. This was back when New Game Plus was still a pretty new concept, and there wasn't a standard naming convention yet, so every game felt obligated to come up with its own. EX game, next game, extra game. Simpler times. In EX game, Aya's levels and stats reset, but she gets to keep one weapon, one armor, and anything left in storage. It's meant to let you replay the story with supercharged gear, though her item capacity resets and her Parasite energy abilities have to be relearned. So really, the smart move is to dump all your bonus points into weapons and armor, the only things that actually carry over. The game also throws in bigger enemy groups and showers you with BP at the end of each chapter, but the real draw of EX game is the new post-game dungeon, the Chrysler building. On paper, it sounds cool, a massive 77-floor bonus area based on the real New York skyscraper, filled with better loot than anything in the main story. Every 10th floor ends in a boss fight, and if you make it all the way to the top, you get a new final battle and a so-called true ending. It's meant to add replay value to an otherwise short game. In practice, though, the Chrysler building is an arduous hellscape from which nobody can hear your screams. The first 70 floors are randomly generated. Floor layouts, elevators, storage rooms, exits, all of it. There are no save points within, and you're only given the opportunity to leave and rest up after every 10th floor. Oh, and there's no in-game map. Every floor is just a recycled set of the same 12 backgrounds over and over. You wander through indistinguishable hallways, praying you're not walking in circles, and when you hit a dead end, congratulations, go back and try again. And why, yes, the official Squaresoft Parasite Eve strategy guide does just so happen to include maps for all possible floor configurations. Totally unrelated, I'm sure. They definitely didn't plan it that way to incentivize book purchases at all. Playing blind, each set of 10 floors took me just over an hour to get through, meaning the Chrysler building adds about 7 or 8 hours to a game whose main story is barely longer than 10. One single optional dungeon that's nearly as long as the rest of the game combined, and it's just the same rooms, shuffled around in a random order. The argument could be made that this successfully addresses the issue of the game's short length, but is this really the type of gameplay you would consider engaging? Just the same 12 hallways recycled in random order ad nauseum for hours on end? The enemies don't even start getting remotely challenging until past floor 50, and then they spike hard. When I got my first game over against the boss on floor 60, I genuinely felt my soul leave my body. I wanted to cry. That was over an hour wasted. An hour spent wandering through the same beige corridors like I was being psychologically evaluated for persistence. And then I died again on floor 70, and I just put the controller down. I took a break for a few days and worked on this script instead. The only thing that kept me going was that I really wanted to get that bonus ending on video. And honestly, hiding the so-called true ending behind this kind of misery is the worst part. It means anyone who actually values their free time or mental health will miss out on major story details, which feels like a pretty cruel design choice for a game that's otherwise so carefully paced. In the end, Parasite Eve feels like a game with its priorities a bit off-kilter. The story is tight and cinematic, but the gameplay can't quite keep up, and when it tries to compensate with bonus content, it overcorrects and delivers something overly dull and needlessly time-consuming. The Chrysler building doesn't test your skill, it tests your patience. Outside of the game's overall structure and content, there are a few quality-of-life issues worth mentioning. Parasite Eve was one of the first Squaresoft titles fully compatible with the PlayStation's analog sticks, but weirdly, it only lets you use either the D-pad or the analog stick, never both at once. And maybe that's fine for most people, but I like controlling IO with the stick and navigating menus with the D-pad. Having to manually toggle between analog and digital every time a menu popped up took a lot of getting used to. I swear I've never hit that little analog button more in my life than I did while playing this game. Item management has a few hiccups too. Storing items at the police station is handy, but you have to deposit or withdraw everything individually. Sure, classic Resident Evil does this too, but there it feels more intuitive. Here, I kept wishing there was an option to dump a whole batch of items at once just to save on button presses. The game also loves throwing keys at you, and while you can stash them once you're done with a dungeon, the rules are inconsistent. In Chapter 4's Hospital, Aya automatically tosses her used keycards, something she never does anywhere else. The first time that happened, I actually said out loud, "Why didn't you do that with every other key before this?" The game also never tells you that you can forfeit the rest of your turn with the square button, which is kind of a big deal when using multi-shot weapons. Every shot locks you in place, leaving you open to enemy attacks, so knowing that you don't have to unload your entire clip in one go would have been helpful, to say the least. You also can't skip any cutscenes, which makes replays drag a bit. Still, these are mostly nitpicks that don't mean much in the grand scheme. So, how well does Parasite Eve actually work as horror? That's a tough question because horror is incredibly subjective, but for me, it never really scared or even unsettled me. RPGs just aren't a great vehicle for dread, if you ask me. They're too mechanical, too number-driven, too detached to make you feel like you're in any real danger. Horror thrives on immediacy, on making you feel vulnerable and without options. But it's hard to put yourself in Aya's shoes when every action is selected from a menu. The game tries to flirt with survival horror through limited ammo and melee weapons, but it just doesn't stick. Every gun inexplicably uses the exact same bullets, and ammo is so plentiful that I never even came close to running out. Once you engage with the upgrade system, Aya becomes a walking tank by the final chapters, which is great for convenience, but absolutely kills any tension. Fear only works when you feel like things could go wrong at any second. That's impossible when you can steamroll every enemy in 2 shots. The only time I actually felt stressed was during the final chase sequence. Genuinely terrifying, but also frustratingly unforgiving, especially after a grueling multi-stage boss fight with no chance to save. Conceptually, the science behind the story is more interesting than scary, and as for the monster designs, yeah, they're trying really hard to be grotesque, but they mostly come off as goofy. The FMVs lean into body horror, people melting into sludge, animals contorting, peeling, and splitting into new forms, but viewed today, they just look like edgier Final Fantasy monsters. Not bad designs by any means, just not scary. It's trying so hard to shock you that it ends up looping back around to being kinda silly. All that said, Parasite Eve is a great-looking game. The graphical leap from Final Fantasy VII to this is remarkable. The characters finally look like humans instead of weird blocky Cupid dolls. And you no longer need FMVs or concept art to understand what they're meant to look like. The pre-rendered backgrounds are just as detailed as FF7's, but with a realistic tone that grounds everything. The fixed camera angles are used creatively, and the real-world setting makes everything feel tangible. You can tell Square actually studied New York City to get these exteriors right, even if the interiors take some creative liberties for the sake of good level design. And really, who can complain about the little Chocobo cameo on the front of the Natural History Museum? The only real visual issue is the text readability. Since there's no voice acting, all dialogue appears as overlaid subtitles without text boxes, which can blend into the backgrounds at times. The soundtrack, though, deserves special mention. Yoko Shimomura steps way outside her usual territory here. Most people associate her with more whimsical fantasy themes, thanks largely to Kingdom Hearts, but Parasite Eve shows just how much range she really has. You've got haunting piano pieces, industrial techno, operatic choral work, and even a vocal ending theme that blends Latin and Spanish lyrics. Square had a reputation for never cutting corners on presentation, and this game absolutely upholds it. In North America, Parasite Eve also came packaged with a demo disc full of previews for upcoming Square titles. A little time capsule of the late 90s PlayStation era. It featured trailers for Bushido Blade 2, Brave Fencer Musashi, and Final Fantasy VIII, and most notably, a playable demo of Xenogears. Xenogears is a weird game in a lot of ways. I don't currently have plans to cover it in full on this channel, but I did check out the demo and was surprised by how substantial it was. I expected a quick 20-minute tease, but somehow squeezed nearly 2 hours out of it. Though, to be fair, I tend to talk to every NPC like I'm interviewing them for a documentary. The game itself seems to be about robots or religion, or maybe robot religion, hard to say. There was a rumor at the time that Xenogears wouldn't be released in English because it was too controversial for American audiences, but that turned out to be a big ol' lie. One giant marketing stunt. In actuality, the translation was already long finished. The controversy was just a ploy to get people fired up and demand its release. Totally unrelated to Parasite Eve, but still a perfect example of the kind of stunt Sony loved to pull back then. Anyway, tangent aside, Parasite Eve's marketing followed the same formula Square used for Final Fantasy VII. Trailers showcased little to no actual gameplay, and instead focused exclusively on the game's pre-rendered FMV. Critics were generally positive on release, albeit not quite as universally glowing as Square's other titles at the time. Reviewers praised the visuals, presentation, story, and the bold, mature tone. The main complaints were that the game was too short, lacked replay value, and didn't quite have the depth of FF7's combat. The absence of voice acting also came up, with critics noting that certain story moments, like the opening opera house scene, would have hit harder with actual voice performances behind them. Even so, Parasite Eve sold nearly 1 million copies in its first 6 months, making it a definite success. Despite its flaws, it's become one of Square's most beloved cult classics, a game that dared to step outside the genre's comfort zone and boldly break many RPG tropes and conventions. Back then, the idea of a cinematic RPG actually meant something, and Parasite Eve was one of the first to prove that that concept could work. Oh, and if you're wondering what the novel's author thought about the game, he liked it. He wasn't involved in development at all, but later said he was, quote, impressed at how well the game makers translated the novel into a video game. Which is probably the nicest compliment you could hope for from a scientist-turned-writer whose book is about spontaneous human combustion. Unsurprisingly, Parasite Eve got compared to Resident Evil all the time, but those comparisons were pretty superficial. Sure, both are horror-themed games starring cops and using fixed camera angles, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. For crying out loud, Parasite Eve doesn't even use tank controls. Now, Parasite Eve 2, on the other hand, is an awful lot closer to Resident Evil, and we just might take a look at why that is in the future. In the end, Parasite Eve is one of those fascinating in-between games, too experimental to be truly mainstream, but too restrained to be a full-on cult oddity. It's messy, sure, but also ambitious in ways few games from its era were. Much like Mitochondria, you can feel Square trying to evolve, not just technically, but artistically. And even when it stumbles, there's something admirable about that kind of swing. It's a snapshot of a studio at its most curious, reaching for cinematic storytelling before the technology could fully support it, experimenting with tone, with mechanics, with identity. It's not perfect, but it's rare to see a game so confident in its weirdness. It's flawed and occasionally frustrating, but also oftentimes brilliant. And perhaps most of all, it's memorable for daring to be something different.